Hello, welcome back. My name is Mariah, and welcome to a new background as well as hopefully a new series on this channel. I have started reading the books I want to do for this series. I've committed to 3, and I've bought a bunch of the books that I want to read as well. So I feel like I'm pretty committed, but we'll see how it goes. Essentially, this series is kind of reading the best books, or the 100 best books, or books you should read in your lifetime, based off a poster that I randomly picked up at an independent bookstore. I will have a clip of it. It's actually beside me on the wall, but it is a scratch-off poster of what is a 100 book bucket list. It's mostly classics or modern classics, which is not what I've always gravitated towards, but I think it would be really interesting to go through the list and see how I feel about the particular choices and how I feel about what's represented in the list overall. Now, like I said, this is the first video, but I've already read the first 3 books for this series. I think I'm gonna pretty much stick with 3 books in each video just to keep things a little shorter. I did go into this challenge having already read 5 of the 100, which is not much, but I have read Frankenstein, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I read the first Harry Potter book. I don't want to talk about that, but it's set to read the series. I'm just gonna let the first 3 books that I read in middle school cover that, because I have no intention of ever completing that series or supporting J.K. Rowling in any way, so we're just gonna say that I've read enough. And then the other 2 were The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde and Macbeth by Shakespeare. I did read Macbeth for school, but everything else I read on my own. Obviously, Harry Potter was a long time ago. That was back in middle school, so it's been over a decade. The other 3 I read more recently in my own time. I really enjoyed Frankenstein and The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Secret History was not the biggest fan of, like so many other people. But yeah, those are the ones going into this that I've already read. That leaves 95 books to get through, some of which are extremely intimidating. I lucked out with this first series, or this first selection of books, and didn't get anything too long. But just to introduce that series, I'm choosing these at random. I did actually change up how I was going about choosing them at random. I was using a random number generator, but then I just added all the books into a spin the wheel thing just so that I didn't have to count them out. But that's how I'm choosing them. Hopefully the wheel will be kind to me in the future, but we'll have to see. But as far as this goes, that is the introduction to this series, and I will send you on over to past me when I started the first book in this series. Hello. So I'm here for my first update. I have a cat right here. He's so cute. You can't see him, but he wants to be pet. The first book that I'm reading for this like 100 book bucket list thingamajig is Birdsong. The author is Sebastian Faulks. I have never heard of this book before. It looks like it was published in the 90s, but it's sort of about or takes place around World War I. I've read the first part. I think there are probably 3 parts of the story. So I read the first part. The first part, I was a little confused because I went into this knowing it was a World War II story. I knew there was like a love affair as well, but World War I, which I know less about. I was a little confused because the first part does not contain any of the war. It's actually pre-war. Doesn't look like there's much talk about it at all. There is like a workers' strike, but I don't think that relates in any way. It looks like part 1 is mostly this like love affair that occurs between a French woman named Isabel and a Englishman named Stephen. And it's interesting, certainly not the best relationship. In fact, I see it as pretty toxic, even though obviously Isabel's husband, the one she's cheating on, is abusive, so it's less toxic than that, but it's not much better. It kind of seems like Stephen views her like as a prize to be won. That's how it comes across to me, even though they're still, for whatever reason, the author's still telling me that their feelings are like genuine and intimate, and I just don't see that as much. And to me, Isabel, I feel like it's honestly kind of unsettling on her end because she's 9 years older than him, and she refers to him as my boy. He's not a child, but he is 20 and she's 29, and referring to him the same way you would refer to your child, with him being so much younger, really rubs me the wrong way, and she does that a lot. I also feel like she is kind of experiencing intimacy, like sexual intimacy, in a way that she hasn't before because of her current relationship with her husband, and that, as well as like the taboo of the affair, is an appeal to her, but she's not really thinking things through. She's almost childish herself in how quickly she latches on to Stephen, and her kind of idealism where she thinks that she can continue a relationship with him even in 1910, when this is certainly not something that's societally accepted. I will say, throughout the course of this first part, the writing has been interesting because it is mostly about this affair, but every now and then Stephen, and even closer to the end of part 1, Isabel, will have like these really morbid thoughts about life and death. And it almost feels like it could be a foreshadowing of the war to come. I know I am partially into part 2 now, and it goes straight into the war. I'm not really seeing that reflected the way I think it would if it was foreshadowing, but I did think it was interesting that those like little pieces of morbidity were like thrown in there. I think it was also to highlight the wastefulness of the wealthy, because Isabel is in a relatively wealthy family with her husband, and Stephen came from a much poorer place. He was an orphan. He grew up in like an institution, and he's gotten by as he is, but he's definitely not in the same social class as Isabel and her family. Another thing about this book I wasn't really expecting, since it's set in or at least starts in 1910 and is set in World War I, for some reason I assumed like the explicitness of it would go in line with something that was written in that time, but it was obviously written in the 90s, so that's not the case. It's actually quite explicit. I mean, not the most explicit thing I've ever read, but like there's certain words that Sebastian didn't need to use, like spurt. We all know what was spurting in that situation, and that was really gross. I didn't love that. I wasn't expecting it. As far as like part 1 goes, I don't really understand why, at this point, why this book would be on like a top 100 books to read list. There's nothing really super original with the whole affair story. I imagine the reason it's on there has more to do with the World War I aspect. Though I will say this again is a book written in the 90s. There are other stories, other books on that list that were written by people who actually fought in World War I. So if it was supposed to represent an account of that time period, I'm not sure why this would be chosen in addition to those other books or in place of other books written by people who actually experienced trench warfare. So yeah, this being on the list is a choice to me. I will also say I don't really know where the story is going. I know we skip directly into the war. We're following a different perspective, a completely new man, but Stephen is present. I don't know what's going on with Isabel or any of her family. I don't know if we're even gonna kind of circle back to that. I would hope that we are, but as of right now in the storyline, they're like, these characters are not in the same vicinity at all. I'm not even sure that they're communicating anymore, and I do have questions about specifically Isabel's family. Maybe not her and of herself, because I got enough of her like inner turmoil reading her perspective, but she did leave behind her 2 stepchildren with a man that was abusive to her, at least. And I worry with one of her stepchildren being a 16-year-old girl who is at a weird kind of rebellious stage in her life, if possibly the anger and the violence that he let out on his wife is now going to be implemented onto her. But I haven't seen or heard anything about them. I do hope we kind of, get some resolution as far as that goes, and it not just be Stephen and Isabel, but I guess I'll have to see. I have 2 more parts to go, but yes, I've started part 2. It's definitely a lot faster paced than the first part, since we're diving directly into some really messed up war times. So I will update again once I've finished part 2 and give you my thoughts about all of that. Back with an unboxing that has nothing to do with this video, really. I just wanted to come on here and document that my pre-order came in. Now, I have made some progress in the book. I think I'm about not quite halfway through, 200 some pages in. Still, like, in the war times, it messed up still. I'm not gonna give like a full update now. I just wanted to come on to share, but yeah, I am still making progress, and I'll go ahead and open this up. This cover is gorgeous. I got the T. Kingfisher's Sword Heart. This isn't new. I think it might have been self-published before, and this is like the traditionally published Barnes & Noble version with the beautiful edges and the beautiful cover. It's so gorgeous. Then we've got our sword. I think this is almost romantic-y, but not quite. This is more like a cozy-ish fantasy. I think the sword might be sentient. I'm not 100% sure. I just know it's T. Kingfisher, and I really love What Moves the Dead by them. And I own all of their books at this... No, that's not true. I own a lot of their books at this point. I've only read the one, but I'm nonetheless intrigued by every last one of them. So this is gorgeous, and I wanted to share. I also picked up a couple more books from the bucket list. Found at the thrift store, I found Tell No One by Harlan Coben. That's a random book to be on the list, but I have it. I know Harlan Coben is like a huge thriller author. I don't know anything about this book. It literally does not even have a synopsis on it, but I have it now. And then I found as well The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which I know is an alien invasion. I watched a video about Orson Welles' adaptation of that. He made it into like a radio show, and some people listening to it actually thought it was real. It was like a whole scandal. It was actually a really funny video to watch, and the way he adapted it was so cool. He adapted it so that it would sound real. Obviously there were disclaimers saying that it was fictionalized, but it was like news reports that would break in between like the music playing on the radio. Very interesting. What a time to be alive. But I have actually been intrigued in reading that ever since I watched the video. Other than it being an alien invasion and they're just like destroying the world, I don't know anything else about it. Apparently there's a twist. Don't know what that twist is because it wasn't spoiled in the video, but I will find out when I read it. But yeah, anyways, it was just an update because I wanted to show off this gorgeous book. I'm so excited to read it. Who knows when that will actually happen, but I will talk to you once I finish the end of part 2 in Birdsong. All right, welcome. I'm back to discuss part 2 and 3 of Birdsong. The reason it's both is twofold. Part 3 is very short, and also I had to speed up my reading because my library loan was about to expire. When I initially got the book out of the library, there was no hold, but now apparently there's 2 people behind me. I don't think I'm gonna finish it before it goes back to the library, but I'm close, and I can just get the ebook, like buy the ebook if I really have to. But I did finish those 2 parts of Birdsong. I've made a pretty decent chunk into part 4, but part 2 follows Stephen in World War I. We also follow less so a character named Jack Firebryce, who is a miner in the war. Like I guess he used to work in coal mines, which is really interesting. I don't know too much about World War I in general. Obviously we go over it a little bit in school, but probably not as much as we should. I had no idea that miners were employed to essentially dig tunnels underneath no man's land and underneath the enemy trenches so that they could set off bombs. I didn't know that was a thing. I looked it up to see if it was accurate, and yeah, that's what they did. And that's what Jack Firebryce is doing. So we follow both of them specifically in 1916 during the war, and they're both in the same trenches. It really is just going over a lot of brutality of war and the mental state of the soldiers in the war. It's interesting because Stephen, through his childhood, he lived in these institutes. He didn't have a parents really, and his grandfather was a criminal. So he lived in essentially like boys' homes or institution for orphans. He didn't describe it as an orphanage, but it's interesting because he describes his time in that institute kind of similar to how he describes his time in the war, at least initially, where there is this lack of individuality. He feels just like a number to the people, the higher ups, and he is honestly treated like one. It seems like the media didn't really tell the truth of the war. It kind of painted it as something that could easily be won, and the British soldiers were all heroes in the war, and it was this almost romanticized thing throughout the media, but which enticed men to sign up, and were ultimately, because of what the media had been portraying, were completely unprepared for what they went into. We see a lot of Stephen's mental health not being great. I mean, I don't think it really ever has been, and somebody points this out to him in the book, like after he's been injured. He points out that like what he's currently doing is to make up for what he lacked in his childhood, and I can definitely see that, because he still has this sense of camaraderie with his fellow soldiers, which is not something he really grew up with. We also see him disassociating a lot. He's described as like distant, closed off, and I do think this is unconsciously due to the trauma he had, not only as a child, but also that he sees during this war. I find it really interesting. He also describes disassociation during battles. This is written in the 90s. I don't know if that word was really common then, but that's definitely what's being described. He has kind of this out-of-body experience, and that's what keeps him moving, because he doesn't feel like he's really a part of what's currently happening. He does also have a lot of anger. He feels like, it's interesting because there are almost parallels between how he views his affair and like just sex and love in general as a release of unresolved conflict and anger, but he also views the war the same way. He doesn't necessarily feel a kind of loyalty to his country. He's using the war, or has resigned himself to using the war, as a means of releasing all this anger that he has. He feels like the war is a punishment for his life not going the way that he wanted it to, and the things that happened in his past, even with Isabel, who we do not see in part 2 or 3. Obviously she's mentioned because she's part of Stephen's past, but she's not actively in those parts. I will also say that I really enjoy, or I find it really interesting, that we have kind of parallel narratives with Stephen and Jack, because they are very different people, but in some ways they do think similarly, but ultimately have very different outlooks. So Stephen, obviously, he's very, like I said, having some emotional turmoil. He's angry. That's why he's fighting. Whereas Jack, we see, on the other hand, he has a son and a wife that he wants to go home to, and he speaks very happily and proudly of the two of them. And though he is suffering, obviously he has seen a lot of things. He's had friends who have died in this war. He still has like that capacity for love that it seems like Stephen has lost a lot of. Though he does have a friend named Weir, who's actually Jack's commander, who also is a very interesting character. He's kind of like this innocent guy. He struggles a lot. He's a drunk because of his time in the war, but overall, like, he is a nice guy. He hasn't really experienced much outside of his home and then immediately going into the military. These are two drastically different lives, and he struggles to kind of have them side by side. We see that a little bit later into part 4, which I'm currently reading. When he goes to visit his family, he's on leave from the military. But yeah, he's a really interesting character. I kind of find his relationship with Stephen to be interesting because they are legitimately friends. They're pretty close, despite kind of having this reluctance to get close to one another since they've seen so many people killed. So yeah, I just think seeing Stephen and Jack kind of going through the same experiences at the same time and having their emotions kind of develop. They're very different people, and seeing them kind of evolve throughout the war side by side is really interesting. Now, and I will say the war part of this is brutal. I mean, trench warfare is obviously really messed up. It does not shy away from how brutal it is. Like the first chapter of this part, somebody gets blown up. Like it's nasty. So definitely, if you do read this, take that into consideration. It continues into part 4. I actually wasn't sure if it was going to, because in part 3, which I mentioned is pretty short, we actually jump forward like 60 years into 1978, and we follow a young woman named Elizabeth in England. It kind of mirrors, in a way, the initial storyline, because she's having an affair with a married man. It's whatever. I'm not sure I really care for her part of the story, but what it's alluding to is that she's most likely related to Stephen. She knows nothing about World War I, and for some reason she decides that she wants to learn about her grandfather, who we assume is Stephen. I guess that hasn't technically been confirmed, but we know he fought in World War I, and she's slowly learning the devastation of that war, which to her had been really downplayed and not discussed. It is kind of still a taboo in society. Like, nobody wants to talk about it because it's depressing, even though all these people died and they deserve to be remembered. So she's essentially delving into that. I will say there is a lot of discussion of her wanting to have children. I don't love that. I mean, maybe it's just my bias because I personally don't want kids, but this is written by a man, and it seems like he's trying to make her like an independent woman, but at the same time trying to establish these stereotypically feminine desires. And I'm not sure like how much I love it just because it's written by a man. I'm not saying that like her feelings aren't valid. It's just, it's a weird discussion to be having when it is a lot to do with womanhood and motherhood, and this author has not experienced either of those things. But yeah, there's just like a big undercurrent of her being, I think she's like 38, so she is running out of time to have children, and she's trying to like describe wanting an occupation and a career does not mean she doesn't want to have children, which obviously that's true for lots of women. It's just kind of, I just can't, I guess maybe it's just because it's written by a man. I guess I can't separate that. I'm like, are you really the one to be having this discussion? So that's my issue with her. I will say it wasn't the most interesting thing in the world because I don't know where her, okay, I know where the author is claiming her desire to learn more about her grandfather is coming from, because he's tying it back to wanting children. He's like saying since she can't have this, or since she doesn't have this, she's going in reverse and trying to find like intimacy with family members that she doesn't know. It's weird. I don't see it. I'm not really seeing her motivation, but this is obviously like in some way going to play into where Stephen's life goes, or where Isabel's life goes. I guess I don't know who her grandmother is either. I just know her grandmother was French and her father fought in World War I. That's all I know. I actually have a theory that it might not be Isabel, but to be fair, it could maybe also not be Stephen. I have no idea, but that's where that's going. I imagine her plotline will come up again later, but it was very brief, and we went back in time again for part 4 to 1917, still during World War I. Like I said, I've gotten quite a bit of a ways through that part. I actually think I'll be finishing it relatively soon, and I will have to update once I do finish that, but we'll get more into the war and into Isabel, because she does show up again, as well as her sister Jean, who's an interesting character. But yes, once I finish that, I will come back and update you about my feelings. Hello, I'm back and I have finished the first book for this video, Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. I actually finished this Must You Be So Loud As You Eat? I just fed the cats their dinner. They're kind of loud, so excuse that. But I did end up enjoying this book. It's definitely not my favorite thing. I have some issues with it, but I gave it a good 3 stars. The majority of the focus was on the main character's experience in World War I, which I appreciated. I personally didn't love the plot outside of that. I did like one aspect of it as far as who he ends up with. I felt like that person had much more of a like romantic intimacy with him rather than Isabel, where I felt like a lot of it was physical, kind of lustful. And there's some comments when she shows back up in this book that kind of just prove that to me. But as far as the final few parts, because there are just some shorter parts where the granddaughter in like the 70s is interspersed between the World War I plot, but for the most part it's World War I. It started out with Weir, the main character's friend, going back home on leave, and there was kind of this indifference that he noticed of his parents and just civilians in general. Same with Stephen. At one point he goes back home and sees this as well, but there's a lack of empathy, a lot of indifference. People don't want to discuss the war even though it's actively occurring. It is kind of a taboo, and that continues into the 70s in Elizabeth's plotline. But it is kind of a stark reality for them to see people are just going about their everyday lives and not really caring about the soldiers who are frankly victims. And he grows, Weir does grow like a resentment towards a lot of the civilians, the people that don't understand what he's been through and don't seem to care to try and understand. But quickly we do return to the war. Stephen does kind of like go into town and he meets Isabel's older sister Jean, who I like as a character. There was one instance where she was kind of implying that she wanted to use sex as like a tool to help Stephen. I did not like that very much. Because she could see his mental state deteriorating, and I don't know, felt like that sort of intimacy maybe what would assist him in that moment. It didn't go anywhere. I thought that was a very strange and just kind of gross aspect, but other than that, she's one of the better characters in this. She's just very caring for Stephen. She, unlike a lot of these other people who are not paying attention to the war, don't want to discuss it, she is constantly like this good force in his life telling him that he can get through it, that he can make it out of the war alive, and there is a purpose beyond the war. Because there's a lot of discussion of this war, this kind of brutality being all these men know because they've been in it for so long, and it's changed them so much. They don't know how it will be possible for them to go back and live a life outside of this warfare. So I do really appreciate having her there as a character and kind of like a backbone or as a shoulder for Stephen to lean on. And we do briefly see Isabel again as well. Spoiler alert, they do not end up together. Isabel has ended up with someone else, and though she does make comments about still feeling like physical attraction to Stephen, nothing about what she says really makes me feel like she loves him. And so that's why I really didn't love that first part, because I didn't really see the connection so much there anyways. I'm glad that it didn't kind of try and force that connection. And there is also kind of a side note, there is a bit of like queer coding in this story. There's one soldier, I mentioned Jack earlier, how I liked seeing kind of his perspective side by side with Steven's, but Jack has a friend named Shaw, and I noticed it earlier in the story, but like I glanced over it. I was like, maybe I'm reading too much into that, where they were going into the shower or the bath, and Jack kind of had this thought about Shaw's backside. Like, essentially, he was complimenting his ass. He didn't say it out loud, but like, that's essentially what it was. I was like, oh, okay. And then later he said that they slept beside each other, and he slept as well beside Shaw as he did beside his wife. I was like, okay, so this is a little more than platonic. And that did continue. There's one line where I have made this mistake in my life, not once but twice. I have loved someone more than my heart could bear. And that's in reference to Shaw. I'm like, so there was definitely some queer coding going on there. As far as the war plotline goes, it was just very depressing. Overall, extremely depressing. We see so many of the people around Steven have died. So many of the people that he started to care for have died, even though he's trying not to care for these men because he worries that they will have exactly that fate. We see him, despite distancing himself emotionally from people, still having the urge, the drive to save them, to want to do everything possible, even if it's illogical, to get them out alive. Because it's interesting, he's almost a little hypocritical, where he internally doesn't feel like there's a purpose, a point to continue going, but aloud he's giving all these reasons to the people around him, like, this is why you continue on, because you can do this and you can do better, you can create a purpose. So it is very interesting to kind of see that inner turmoil, but still wanting to resolve that or placate that turmoil in others. And there is a very end moment where we see Steven actually is saved by the enemy. It's at the very end of the war, and I mean, the spoilers, but it's at the very end of the war, and there's kind of this beautiful moment where the enemy soldier from the Germans, he's actually a German Jew, Levi, saves him, and they see each other, and they've both experienced like so much grief. We get Levi's perspective as well. They both experienced so much grief and realize that this is finally over. Despite having been enemies so long, they literally collapse into each other's arms and start sobbing. And I have really appreciated Levi. I thought he was a very sweet character, and it's sad to know, like, in retrospect, obviously this is historical fiction, World War II hasn't occurred yet, but we can assume what his fate ends up being with World War II happening in just 30 years. And he's going to be older, potentially even disabled by the time that rolls around. So it's really sad to see such a good character, such a good person, and knowing that they are going to come to most likely a sad, devastating end. So that's what we see in the World War I plotline. Fast forward, we have the 70s plotline with Elizabeth. I didn't love her plotline. I understand why it was there, but I don't think it was super necessary. I appreciated, like, she's trying to decode Steven's diaries and learn more about him and her family and the war in general. So she visits some of the veterans who fought alongside Steven, and it speaks to them. She meets one of them that's, for the most part, incoherent. He just kind of speaks little snippets of his past, but she continues to go and visit him because he hasn't had anyone visit him. He's alone. Despite everything he's been through, despite everything he survived, he somehow ended up forgotten. And I imagine that is a very sad reality for a lot of veterans. It's certainly sad to have read about that and know that despite everything he's been through, this is where he ended up. So we see that, we see her, like I said, decode these notes and learn essentially everything that we read about in the World War I plotline. And then after that is a lot of her and her boyfriend, who is married with children, having a child together. I really did not like that part at all. I didn't think it was necessary. I didn't think it was done well. It really seemed for a while that Elizabeth was kind of like on this journey, realizing that she's worth more than this man who's, first off, cheating on his wife. So that's already a red flag, that someone would cheat on their spouse with you, especially when he's admits that it's not a bad relationship. She's done nothing wrong. She's a good person. He just thinks he married the wrong woman. Yeah, so there's that, and he's making no moves to actually leave this woman. He's making promises and blah blah blah, and I think she for a minute it seemed like she was gonna learn that, like, she shouldn't wait around for this man. She's better than that. And then that just never happens. It ends with her kind of graphically having a child, and the man, her partner who's married, delivering the baby, and it ends on like this note where they're gonna live happily ever after. And I just that didn't make any sense to me. With everything that we've been through, why the hell would you end the story with this woman just happily with this man who's still married and still has kids with this other woman that he's actively raising, but he's still with this woman. He doesn't plan on leaving this woman, and he doesn't also plan on telling her that he's having an affair, and Elizabeth doesn't plan on telling her mom that the man she had a baby with is a married man. So it seems such a strange point to end the story on. And if that was going to be Elizabeth's conclusion, then I didn't see the point in her storyline being there, because it was extremely unsatisfying to me. Many lessons could have been learned. Elizabeth could have had growth, but she kind of, other than learning about her past and having, you know, respect for the people that survived this war, which obviously is a good thing, but other than that, she had no personal development, and there was so much potential for it that it was frustrating. So yeah, overall, I didn't love the 70s plotline. I didn't love the part 1 affair plotline either. I do appreciate that it led us to Jean and Stephen having someone so reliable in his corner, but I did enjoy, or enjoy is the wrong word because it was depressing, but I did like the story. I thought it was interesting to see the experience of World War I, even if this was fictionalized. It's something I don't know too much about. I kind of understand why it's on the list, because we do see the World War I aspect and see that character go through so much mentally. I will say it is, I think, still strange that it's on this list, because there are other books on the list also set in World War I, but by people who actually experienced World War I. They're fighting. Why are you fighting? Now they're just gonna stare at each other. But yeah, I do think it's strange that, like, I do think it's strange that there seems to be kind of an abundance of these stories, and I do believe it's the same with World War II. I think there's gonna be quite a few historical and thematic things that are just gonna be repeated in these books, and I don't love that, because this list that I got specifically, I just picked it up randomly at a store, it's not very diverse. And you could have really taken some of these that are essentially telling the same thing and replaced it with diverse authors like Zora Neale Hurston. She's not on there. Toni Morrison. She's not on there. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He's not on. Like, there's just a lot of examples that I feel like they should have been represented, but this list didn't do them. And I am questioning why that is when we have so much of kind of the same storyline represented in the list. But, you know, overall, I get it. I understand why it's there. I don't understand the over-representation of World War I, especially with this novel not being a kind of a timely one. It is historical fiction, whereas All Quiet on the Western Front isn't really, because it was written in that time period. So yeah, the over-representation is confusing me a bit, but you know, I'm glad I read this book, and overall it was 3 stars, and I will be picking a new book to read from the list. I don't know what it is yet. I'm gonna just pick it at random, but I will let you know what it is in my next clip. Okay, so I'm back with my second book for this challenge, and if you saw the B-roll, it's obviously know that it is 1984 by George Orwell. I am a little over halfway through at this point. First thoughts, I mean, I am enjoying this. I'm very intrigued. I knew what this was about. Obviously, everyone knows Big Brother. This is required reading for a lot of people. My school district was not the best, so it was not required reading for me. I've actually only read one other George Orwell, and it's not a novel. It's actually a short story about him killing an elephant in English-occupied India because he was in the army at the time. It was so random, and it was for my world literature class, even though that was the only book thing we read that took place outside of Europe. Very worldly, but nonetheless, I'm reading 1984 now. This one I think very much obviously deserves a place on this list because it is like the OG dystopian. It is unsettling in multiple ways. I honestly wasn't expecting the main character to be someone I dislike so much, and I don't know anything about George Orwell as a person other than that he was in the army and obviously he killed an elephant. But other than that, like, I don't know his track record with women or his opinions on women, but if his main character is potentially a representation of himself in some way, then I'd say he's a violent misogynist. But I can't, it may just be the character. I have no idea about the author. But To speak on this book, these are mostly classics that I'm discussing, so I feel like there will be spoilers inevitably in these videos, but I'm not gonna go like into detailed spoilers. Just to make a disclaimer, that may be a thing that you hear. I did find, like, going into this, you can see most of my tabs I think are concentrated at the very front of the book, and that's because the world this was in was just very intriguing to me right off the bat. Obviously, I can see how it inspired so many other dystopians. I saw almost immediately essentially a war film that they were watching, or that the main character was describing, that really reminded me of the Hunger Games, because it appeared that this wasn't really a film. It was actually just literal war on screen that they were watching, and citizens were cheering as children were murdered. And so that very much gave Hunger Games vibes. I'm sure Suzanne Collins got a lot of inspiration from this, and it was unsettling. It's also, you could say that we see similar things nowadays. I don't think like cheering is that relevant, but it's not as if I haven't seen hundreds of children being killed by Israeli bombs in Palestine. But that is kind of a comparison that I see to nowadays, that this is something that we so regularly see in our society, almost to the extent for that it's normalized, and it should never be. Luckily, for most people, it's not celebrated, but it shouldn't be something that we're desensitized to in the way that we are now. But as far as the actual plot of the story goes, essentially we're in this society that seems very communist-like to me. It also in some ways resembles Nazi Germany, which this was written in 1949, so like right after World War II. But essentially, as we all know, Big Brother is this all-seeing, omnipresent being that is their government in 1984. And it's interesting that these people, this kind of caste system that they have, where people are being watched constantly, or at least our main character is, and the people of the caste that he is a part of. So he's part of the party, which is essentially like a low-level government worker, I guess you would say. And those people are constantly being monitored in their own homes by essentially TVs and recording devices that don't turn off. And it's monitored to the extent of like emotions are being monitored, facial expressions. Any twitch that may seem out of place and not what the government wants of their people is being held against the individual. So much so that these people seem to be either completely ignorant or devoid of emotion, because those are the only two options. We see in this story a lot of examples of manipulating the citizens, indoctrinating certain beliefs in citizens. So, for example, there's 2 minutes of hate every day where they watch essentially propaganda to remind or incite hate regarding the enemy, which in this case, ironically, again, this being written so soon after World War II, is a Jewish man who supports freedom of speech, freedom of emotion. Let me see if I can find it exactly. Ah, yes. Advocating for freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. And these are things that the government and these people are disgusted that he would possibly advocate for. So that's the kind of society that they're in. And they're watching propaganda of this man as well as other enemies, which are like Eastern Europeans, it sounds like. In this world, it's showing soldiers of them, so that these citizens' heads are constantly being filled with images that they find fearful, and therefore continuing this fear and this hatred of certain people, the certain people that the government wants to either be against or to control, potentially. We also see like there are bombings occurring typically in the working class communities, which the party doesn't seem to see as human beings, because they're not monitored the way the party is. They're allowed to continue essentially a kind of a normal life, but they're poor and really just trying to live day to day and not fighting against that because they don't have the resources to do so. And so their bombs or rocket bombs are going off in these places, and it's supposedly the enemy sending those. But there's this theory that I had, and one of the characters did finally bring it up, that this is also a tool of fear from the government, that they are bombing their own country, their own people, though they view the poor people as less than human, but they're bombing themselves essentially to further incite fear, so that it's not just something that people are hearing about or being taught. It's something that they're seeing firsthand, or at least they're being manipulated into believing they're seeing this violence firsthand. Now, that hasn't been confirmed yet, but to me it seems very on par with what this government would do. We also see similar things, like I said, parallels to World War II, where the children are in programs called the spies, where this government is all they've ever known, so they're taught to look for signs of deception, signs of dissent, no matter how small, in the adults around them, and they're used essentially as spies to turn on the adults, that whether that be a stranger or their parents, very similar to Hitler's youth during World War II. We're also seeing manipulation of media, of history in of itself. The main character's job is essentially to rewrite articles to be in the favor, or look to be in the favor of Big Brother and the party. And essentially this company, the government that he works for, they go and track down all the articles that were already printed, destroy them, and then redistribute them with the new manipulated information. It's literally rewriting history, which is so eerie to think is a possibility. Same with the people who are considered to be against the government, or just too smart for their own good. There's a character in this who's clearly very intelligent, but only speaks positively of his government. But since he can think critically, he's seen as a threat, and we see him disappear. No one ever talks about him. Any physical records of his job or him in general, they cease to exist. This happens with all kinds of people, and it is what we believe to be the inevitable fate of the main character. It's so unsettling, but deeply interesting to read about. Now, as far as the main character goes, he does have, some memories before Big Brother became the sole government of this world, and he isn't content with hiding his feelings. He feels a hatred toward his government, and he wants to do something to fight it, but doesn't know how. We see him writing in a diary, essentially spiraling about his thoughts and what he feels that he can believe, what he does or doesn't know. He doesn't know what's real because of how much this government has falsified things. So it's interesting to be in his head in some cases. That's all very interesting to see his inner turmoil and his hatred for this government. I have some red flags in this book, and those are actually red flags as far as characters go, specifically the main character and the love interest, whom I don't think is necessary. The whole love romantic plot of this, I don't know why it's a thing, other than I think it's potentially going to screw the main character over. But we see pretty early on he has a dislike for women, and a specific woman as well that he is attracted to, but who has a vow of celibacy. And he seems to find this as some sort of personal insult. He has violent thoughts about things he wants to do to her. He says that he essentially wants to rape and murder her, which was unexpected. I don't know if I ever expect to like love a main character, but I'm not expecting to have that kind of like visceral, disgusting thoughts going on in their heads. I especially wasn't expecting that from this, where obviously this guy's going against a government that is a bad government, so you would expect me to want to root for him. His misogyny does not lean towards that. His violent thoughts, because he doesn't just think about her in this way. Like, there's other just random people that he's getting his way in some way or another, and they're like, he's like, I wish I could hit them in the head with a pickaxe. Like, that's crazy to me. These sudden just outbursts of violent thoughts are absurd, but I guess in some way it makes sense because he has no emotional outlet. No one does. So there's no way for them to regulate that. It's interesting to think about. It is a jarring aspect of this book. I just wasn't expecting that to occur. And then as far as like other characters, we really only have one other, which is Julia, the woman that he initially wanted to rape and murder. And weirdly enough, she's the love interest. I'm not sure. To me, it feels like she might be up to something, but she also could just be completely out of her mind, because he admits to her that he initially wanted to rape and murder her. And see, I think me and any other woman would get the hell away from him as fast as possible, but this girl laughed and then kept seeing him romantically. She's unwell, or she has ulterior motive. I guess I'll find out. But she's an interesting character to follow as well. Obviously, we're not in her head, but she's younger than this main character, and she doesn't really have any experience in a life outside of this government. And so we see that she clearly doesn't like the government, or at least that's what she says, but she doesn't appear to want to take any action against the government. She's content with essentially living that life and doing private acts of rebellion, because this intimate relationship that they have, since emotion is essentially illegal in of itself, is obviously not something that they're allowed to do. So it's being viewed as this almost rebellion in of itself. So she's content with that sort of rebellion, but actual change she doesn't seem to think is necessary. She doesn't seem to understand the context, how horrifying it is that the government is literally erasing history or falsifying history. She accepts that that's what they're doing. She just doesn't seem to understand why it's important. And I think in some ways that's why I think the main character is going to inevitably be screwed over by her, because he's wanting to do more. He wants to be a part of a rebellion. Whether he sees any change in his lifetime, he doesn't seem to care, but he wants to actively fight against Big Brother. And where I'm at in the plot now, he's taking steps towards that. I'm not convinced that Julia really wants to be a part of that. She's there because he is, but I think in the long run she'd happily turn on him to continue her own private rebellions. So I don't know if that's what happens. I guess I'll have to see. But where I'm at now, like I said, he's just now kind of taking steps to actually go against the government, quite literally, rather than just having an intimate relationship, doing things he's technically not supposed to do, but not actively fighting the government or trying to undermine them. And we do see him speak with someone from this rebellion, the Brotherhood, and he talks about the things that they'll need to do as part of this rebellion. So for examples, and I understand that rebellion isn't pretty, but the examples given are you prepared to distribute habit-forming drugs, to disseminate venereal diseases, to do anything that will likely cause demoralization and weaken the power of the party? And those specific examples with the drugs and the diseases, those seem to me quite harsh and almost similar to things that white people have done themselves to marginalized communities, introducing drugs and diseases as a way of weakening people who have something they want. So it does really make me question, obviously, the government they're fighting against is bad, but are the people fighting against that government necessarily good either? When he's asked about this, about the things he's willing to do, he just swallows it and says yes. And there's no real critical thinking about what that says about him or about the Brotherhood. I wonder if that's going to be explored. I guess maybe not. George Orwell was a soldier in English colonized India. I have to assume he supported that in some way. I could be wrong. He could have just been there and absolutely hated what he was doing. I don't know, because I don't know too much about this man. I would like to see it kind of discuss the morals behind the Brotherhood itself, to kind of think critically on that as well, rather than solely just anything to undermine Big Brother. It doesn't matter how bad kind of situation that you're putting innocent people in to achieve your own goals. Now I know I'm about to read some literature on the Brotherhood in this next chapter, so maybe that'll give me a little more insight, but this is a new aspect that's interesting to me, and I wonder where he's going to take that and what he's going to choose to put in a more critical light, or what he's like going to just gloss over and accept as fact. I'm interested. I know that apparently the end of this book, things get kind of crazy. My friend told me it gets wild. So I'm interested to see things go down. I imagine I have less than 100 pages. No, that's not true. I have like about 100 pages left. Like I said, I'm over halfway through, so I imagine things are gonna go down pretty soon, or at least start to go down pretty soon, especially since he's entered this Brotherhood. I'm intrigued to see where the plot goes, and hopefully he does kind of have some discussion, some critical thoughts regarding the rebellion's morals as well, but I'll just have to see. But as of right now, like I said, I do not love being in this main character's head because he's not a good person. But I am very intrigued. I definitely understand why this is on the list of 100 books to read. I don't know if both of George Orwell's most popular books need to be on the list, because it seems kind of strange to have multiple representations of an author when you could just have more authors and more diverse authors, but we'll see. I haven't read Animal Farm either. Maybe both of these books tackle different subjects and both of these books deserve to be on the list. I'll just have to come to that decision myself when I finally do read Animal Farm. But yeah, I'll go back to this and I will update once I finished. So I am back and I finished 1984 by George Orwell, and I think I was saying at the end of the last little update that we were going to learn more about the Brotherhood and the revolution, or I thought we were. We didn't. Well, it was like the book that the Brotherhood wrote, and it was, I guess, supposed to be a manifesto or something along those lines, but even the main character acknowledges that he's not learning anything new from it. It's going into like how certain aspects of the government are used to control people and keep them in poverty and all that jazz. So he acknowledges that this isn't new information, but it does make him feel less crazy because he believed he was the only one that saw this was going on. And that's good for him, I guess. But it was really boring, that like 20-page section of reading essentially a textbook about things that we already knew. Like, my guy, it could have been a paragraph. It didn't need to be 20 pages. But nonetheless, it didn't actually teach us anything. As far as the remaining book goes, and I did ultimately give this a 4 stars. I will say I like the beginning, like setting up the world the most, because I found that the most interesting. The second half, or the second half of my notes, go over spoilers. I mean, like, it's pretty inevitable that he was going to get caught, and he says this multiple times in the book, so I guess it's not technically a spoiler that he does. I won't go too much into how or who is involved. I will say, like, it's interesting. It's kind of mind trippy because he's being tortured psychologically and physically. He's just messed up from everything that they're doing, but certain aspects are left a little unsaid. So there's a character who's doing the torturing, who it seems like maybe was a victim of this at some point as well, or at least he says some stuff that implies that, but it's never fully, like, explained, which I find really interesting. It's a lot of Winston being, like, gaslit. He's made to believe that he's crazy. He's just come to this conclusion finally that he's not, and then suddenly these people are essentially telling him the opposite of what he knows to be true, but are so vehement about it that he believes that he's the crazy one, even though obviously to me and all the other readers 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5, but according to the party it does. So yeah, essentially that last half of the book is just a constant torture and manipulation, and we see Winston slowly changing from his rebellious state to what the party wants him to be. He's slowly just not becoming a human anymore, and it is really interesting. There's like this last portion where it's weird, he's in one place but then suddenly he says he's in another and that he's being killed. And to me, I guess this is very much a spoiler, to me it seems like that has to be a metaphor. Like, he's not actually being killed because he can't be in 2 places at once. What I think it's saying is that his consciousness, him as the individual Winston, is being killed. There's like this switch where he finally has become part of the collective party. So he's no longer himself, he's just part of the machine, which is obviously really is a scary thought, but it's definitely interesting to read about. Since there is it's just a lot of the same stuff occurring in the second half, I guess I don't have too much to say about it. Overall, the book is really unsettling. I could do without the romance. I didn't think it added anything, but it was really interesting. I understand why it's a book that's on this list. I see a lot of implications even now, especially with Trump attacking the Smithsonian and this book having such a heavy theme of manipulating history. Honestly scary that was something that came out the same time I was reading this book. It's very much still relevant, even if I do have issues with it. So overall, it is a 4 stars, and I'm really glad that I read it. But that is my second book down for this, and I will be moving on to my third and the last one for this video. Hello. So I'm here to discuss the next book on the list, which is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I am a little over halfway through. I meant to update earlier in the day. I forgot, so now it's nighttime and I'm in bed, but I wanted to update that I am halfway through this. If you didn't know what this is about, it is a true crime novel, like honestly one of the first true crime novels, or maybe the first to get the amount of traction that it did. This was initially published in 1965. It's about a quadruple murder that took place in Kansas, seemingly with no motive, but we do go through the entire case in the story. So the day of, we don't actually get a depiction of the crime as it's occurring. I don't know if that's anything that was ever provided by the perpetrators or not, but we go through the day of, the perpetrators afterwards, kind of fleeing, their moves, all that jazz. We go see the detectives, the manhunt, the trial, the eventual execution of the perpetrators. As far as where I'm at now, we've known from the beginning who the perpetrators are. I mean, you get their narrative pretty early on. I did know about this crime prior to picking up this book, so I already knew who was involved and who was killed. Hi. He knows it's bedtime. Regardless of whether or not they were given a narrative of their own, I already knew who the perpetrators were. But as far as the first half of this book, it kind of goes through just the day of the crime and then briefly what occurs afterwards, leading up to the perpetrators being identified, but not quite there. That actually happens at the beginning of part 3. So this is interesting. I've only read one other true crime book, and that was I'll Be Gone in the Dark by The Ferret is Itchy. That was I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara, and parts of it, not all of it, were written kind of in a narrative style. This entire book is written like it's a fictional narrative, which makes it easier to read. I do kind of feel kind of iffy about it regarding like character thoughts. A lot of them are in quotes, so I imagine it's something that these people said at one point, and the author is not just attributing thoughts to them. But I do, especially with the victims, they obviously can't really be quoted properly. Any sort of conversation or thoughts that they're feeling, or that the author is attributing to them, that's just based off of what others saw from them that day. They can't give that account. So I am skeptical of the narrative style being used because of that, and for other reasons as well, which I'll get into. But I'm gonna wait until I finish the book to kind of like research if there's any controversy regarding how he portrays them or how the family feels, because we're not getting much from the family of the victims in this so far. Obviously I haven't gotten to the trial portion where they would maybe be a little more involved, but so far they really haven't been talked about much at all. And I feel like we should have in true crime a focus on the victims and the family members of the victims who in themselves are victims. So, but that's obviously me looking at it from a modern true crime standpoint, because that's what I think ethically we should be focusing on. But I do need to keep in mind this was written in 1965. Speaking of which, just a heads up if you ever want to read it, there's definitely some language that is accurate to 1965 and that I do not approve of. Lots of slurs. Most of them, I will say, are in quotations. So again, when it's in quotes, for people that were still alive at the time of this novel being written, or in the process of this novel being written, I have to assume that the quotations are actually pulled from things they've said. So as much as I would prefer it's censored, at least not blatantly used, I do understand that those uses of slurs are accurate to what they said. The only exception, I think, would be the G slur in reference to Romani people. That was used just as a descriptor for one of the characters, or I shouldn't say characters because these are real people. And that's another thing with the narrative style being what it is. As easy as it is to read, it does make them seem like characters, but they're not. Obviously this really happened. 4 people are dead, well 6 in total, because the perpetrators were executed. So that is the narrative being in like a fictional way rather than listing facts or doing a combination of the two does kind of make it harder to think of them as real people, if that makes sense. So I'm going through my notes. As far as the writing style, I've gotten used to it. For the most part, it's good. Like I said, with it being a fictional or written like a fictional narrative, that makes it easy to read. But my God, this man loves long sentences. Like, I don't know if they're technically qualified as run-on sentences, but I've never seen so many semicolons used. And so many parentheses. He'll just have a parentheses in the middle of a sentence, but within the parentheses there will be multiple sentences. And it makes it hard to understand sometimes, because it's like you're interjecting a thought in the middle of a current thought. So I'm reading a section, a full thought that's separate from that section, and then the remainder of the initial section. So it gets a bit confusing at times, and I have to reread sentences every now and then because he gets distracted or he just wants to throw in little tidbits. It's a little much. I do also, as far as like the investigation goes, I know this is 1959 when this occurred, but I do cringe at the way that they go through this crime scene and all the people that are being allowed into this crime scene and just completely messing with evidence. Obviously, they're very limited in like the DNA evidence that they could have used at this time, but I know that shoe prints and stuff like that are going to come into play. And with just bringing in a civilian when you're going through the initial walkthrough of the crime scene could have completely messed up those shoe prints. To me, it's extremely irresponsible. Even for then, I don't know why you would bring a civilian into that when you know that there are dead bodies inside of the house. But they did, apparently. So that's really a choice. I'm glad, despite the interesting choices that they made in their investigation, they did still apprehend the perpetrators. As far as themes in this, I think we're going to explore how the community has been impacted by this crime and what was a smaller town where people, it's cliche, but quite literally in 1959 left their doors unlocked, and how we're seeing a little bit of how there's this sense of distrust. Some people are leaving, some people are side-eyeing everyone they see. I think everyone is, because the assumption when this first occurred was that it was someone within the community. And so this is kind of robbing their community of its sense of safety. So that is always interesting to see. One of the brief moments we saw from the victim's family also talked about the resentment that the community is building towards one another. There's this distrust, but at the same time, like, people are so ready for vindication, for vengeance, ready for whoever this perpetrator is or whoever they in their mind have decided it is to be punished physically, to be executed. And that's an interesting part to see. I really do wish we could see more from the victims' families, because this specific person was talking about how taking another life, even though their family was killed, would not be the way to move forward in their opinion, so he seems to be against execution. I know that these perpetrators do end up being executed. I don't know if how the rest of the family felt about that, if that's how they wanted that to proceed. And I do think, I know people can have differing opinions when it comes to the death penalty and stuff like that, but I do think the family's belief should definitely play a role in deciding whether someone gets life in prison or gets the death penalty. So I do hope when we get to the trial portion I can see more of their opinions, because so far I've only seen that one man's, and I believe that was the brother of Bonnie, which is the mother of this family. The Clutter family, there's 4 of them. I think I mentioned it's a mother, father, and their daughter and son who were murdered. And as far as like the characters, it is interesting, and I don't know what Truman Capote is kind of trying to get at with this. We're getting a lot of exploration of the perpetrators, specifically Perry. He is not necessarily the mastermind behind all of this. That's his partner, Dick. But with Perry, he obviously did go along and assisted in killing 4 people. It's interesting. We're getting a lot of like emotional exploration of him. We're getting a lot of his background and his family life growing up, which wasn't good, and his current relationship with his sister and his father, which are strained at best. And I mean, it's certainly interesting to read about. I don't know if the author is trying to make us, the reader, feel some sort of sympathy for him, or try and give him a reason why he ended up the way he did. I mean, I obviously feel sympathy for a child that goes through any situation, though I don't believe that that's like an excuse for then growing up to become a murderer. And it's with the amount of exploration and justification we're getting with Perry, it almost feels like that is what he's doing, trying to kind of give a reason or to make us feel like this is some sort of mitigating circumstance for Perry, which, seeing as the victims of his crime have nothing to do with how he was raised, he didn't know these people, obviously that can't be a mitigating circumstance. So I'm interested to see if maybe if anyone in the family or just any reviewers have kind of pointed out how he focuses a lot on that character, and see how they feel about that portrayal. The other perpetrator, Dick, we don't get too much about him. There's like a brief moment where he feels bad for putting his parents in a bad situation, but that's pretty fleeting. It comes up for a second and then it's like he doesn't give a shit, and that's sort of his entire character. He seems like a criminal through and through, or at least that's how he's being portrayed, and obviously he is a criminal. He's just constantly stealing and cheating and sleeping around with people who are much younger than him. Is this one girl an actual child? One of them might be a minor, so no, he's overall just a bad guy, and he's being portrayed as that. There's not really much substance being pushed behind him the way it is with Perry. And then lastly, we do get a little bit of some exploration of how this is affecting the investigators, specifically Dewey. I think he's the main guy. This investigation is kind of overtaking his life. It's all he talks about. He's lost weight, he's not sleeping, so we get glimpses of that. Again, not nearly as much as we do with Perry. I don't know why we're focusing so much on Perry. It's kind of strange to me. It is, I mean, it's interesting, I can't lie, but I don't want this to be some kind of an excuse. Like his hardships, his struggles to be some sort of excuse for him to have done all that he has. So I'm gonna keep an eye out on that, and hopefully with the second half of this book we'll get some more exploration of the family, since we are going into the more political, or not political, legal side of things with the trial and presumably the aftermath of the trial and execution. So hopefully we get some more of that. Hopefully we get more about the community impact as well, because that kind of, again, wasn't focused on as much as Barry was. So I'm hoping to see a shift as far as that goes, seeing more about the investigator, the family, the community. I do know like how this crime or this ends, obviously with the execution and everything, but I don't know the ins and outs of the case. So I am interested to see how they end up being apprehended and all that jazz. But I will, since I am halfway through, I have 2 more parts to go. I'll update once I finish this, and this will actually be my last book for this vlog, so I will complete this and I'll be back to close everything out. Bye. I turned on this camera to record my little menace, also the newest member of the family, and then I didn't click record, but here he is. His name is Sycamore, and he likes to knock all the books off my bookshelves. Why you gotta do that, man? Just 'cause? Okay, he did it over there too. I don't know if you can see that. Yep, there it is. But you know what? Whatever makes you happy, man. Hi, I'm back with my final update for this video. I have finished In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I am not rating this as it is true crime. Nonfiction in general, I prefer not to rate a lot of times because it involves real experiences and I don't really want to put a star rating on someone's life. But regardless, I have finished this. It's just not going to get a rating from me. Now to discuss what occurred in the second half of this book. This was essentially a continuation of the manhunt and then the kind of legal proceedings when the perpetrators of this crime were caught. I was hoping, as I mentioned in the last clip, that we would get more insight into the family and the community and see the impact there. Unfortunately, that's not what we got. We do briefly see like how the case impacted the investigators. We see that he's lost a lot of weight. It seems that the only thing he thinks about is the case, and even when he got answers, there's kind of a sense of dissatisfaction. He expected there to be a cause that he could understand, but the perpetrators, as we know, if you know anything about this case, they didn't know the victims in any way, so their crime was rather illogical. And then the little impact that we see on other people outside of the case, like friends and family of the victim. We see a little bit of Bobby, who was Nancy's boyfriend. We see him in just essentially a deep pit of depression after her death. It's a lot of self-isolation. He refers to himself as ill, and he struggles to share his grief, it looks like, with his family and with others. He does a little bit with the friend of Nancy, Sue, but even that becomes strained after some time. So we just get brief glimpses into that. Unfortunately, I wish it would have gone more into the family and the people who were left behind by the family, and it didn't. I think those are who are important when we're discussing true crime cases. Obviously, there is a need to discuss the perpetrators as well, because they're the reason these crimes occurred to begin with, but I don't believe they should be the sole focus. There really needs to be a balance for this to be considered beneficial or ethical to me in terms of like just true crime consumption. However, of course, this was the beginning of true crime novels, and in 1966 this probably wasn't as relevant of a conversation, though we kind of do see similar topics come up as far as people's intrigue with crime. So for example, like they have an auction at the home of the Clutters to sell off their assets, their property, just whatever, as you would at when someone passes. And they have like an enormous crowd, 3 times the size of what a typical estate sale or auction would have. And a third of this crowd came because they were drawn in by the details of this crime. They wanted to get a glimpse of the house where it occurred. And then we also see 2 other inmates that the perpetrators end up in prison with. And there's like this brief mention of how a bunch of young women showed up at their trial, very kind of Ted Bundy-esque, where the women talked to him or had relationships with him while he was in prison, even though he's a monster, which I don't understand that. It baffles me, the idea that you would find that attractive. But we're not here to discuss that. It's just something that I noticed mentioned in this that is still very relevant when we discuss true crime now. We see a lot of that going on, and just the kind of obsession with the novelty of it rather than thinking about it critically, thinking about what can be done to better protect ourselves moving forward and to help the victims' families now that they've gone through the unimaginable. But unfortunately, the majority of this book, it was really just following the perpetrators, Dick and Perry. Primarily, again, we follow Perry. I did actually read into this a little bit, into Cappo's research and critics and what people who were actually involved with the case have said about the book. And it was stated that Cappo was, when he did interviews with the perpetrators, he did have kind of a fascination with Perry and the way he thought. And that's definitely reflected in the text. Again, I really don't like that the main focus was on them and on their background, especially on his, as he is the one who actually shot all 4 of these people. We're looking at him in almost a really sympathetic lens, and there are parts of this where characters, or not characters because they're real people again, like for example, the sheriff or the undersheriff's wife, the jail cells that held these guys before their trial were attached to her home, essentially. And in this novel, it seems like she and Perry actually become friends, and she has a lot of sympathy for him and cares for him despite what he's done. But in real life, she said that she didn't have that kind of relationship with him and that they barely spoke. So clearly, Truman Capote is adding in these elements to make the reader feel sympathy for Perry. And obviously, again, his background was horrible. He may have had a mental illness. There was discussion of the psychology of everything, which I found very interesting. I disagree with it to some extent, but we get the context of him, and I understand why you would be sympathetic towards him. I am not sympathetic for him now that he's committed these actions. I'm sympathetic for the child that went through what he did, but that did not make him do what he did as an adult, which is kill 4 people. And so that, it definitely just rubs me the wrong way that he was like that. And he clearly didn't care about Dick, the other character, very much. There was a lot of discussion of his family, who I don't think people talk about it very much, but a lot of times the perpetrators' families are victimized in some ways as well. We see his mother kind of wonder what she did wrong, even though when we look into Dick's background, he was raised perfectly fine. He wasn't abused. She didn't do anything wrong. She couldn't have stopped him from becoming who he was, I don't think. But she has to live with that and live with the understanding that because of his actions, she also is going to be losing a child. And we see her gain a relationship with another death row inmate's mother, which I was glad to see. I actually was happy to see that she wasn't completely alone. Her husband did pass away not long after the trial of Perry and Dick. So she, I imagine, was not in a very good place. I'm glad to have seen that resolution with her and someone that she could confide in. But, you know, other than that, we're focusing just on Dick and Perry. And Dick is clearly portrayed as someone who is just overall a criminal. He describes himself as very envious of others. And I think he may be a kleptomaniac. Just from like some of the quotes from him and his actions, it seems like there's an impulsive aspect of it. Or maybe he just likes the thrill. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know for sure, but that's kind of the impression that I get from him. And then as far as I mentioned the psychology being discussed, I do just find psychology in general interesting, whether I agree with the analysis or not. There was this paragraph where we kind of went into both Dick and Perry's psychology. Neither of them were considered to be legally insane, but they both were thought to have some sort of mental illness, which makes sense. I don't think anybody who commits a crime like this is going to be completely mentally well. But Perry specifically, it was believed, they described it as schizophrenia, but it actually seems like he was having dissociative episodes. And how he described the crime occurring, the initial crime, the first murder of the 4, did remind me of that as well. So I thought that was very interesting to see the discussion of it through an actual psychologist and their lens on how this may be an act of insanity. And while that may be true for the initial murder, the first one, it is not, however, true for the following 3. And the psychologist even like addresses that, but for some reason he feels that the inciting murder being an act of insanity somehow makes the entire crime an act of insanity, but I disagree. He clearly made a choice after killing this man in a moment of rage. That's, I mean, kind of, Perry says exactly that. He says that he was always full of anger because of everyone that had done him wrong, and the Clutters had not done him wrong but had been the ones who paid for it. And so I can see that, like, that's that kind of sudden murder occurring kind of in a moment of insanity or a moment of rage, an act of passion, if you will, even though he's not who that anger is technically targeted towards. However, Perry then came to his senses and he chose to murder the other 3 people in a hopes to get away. Those were not acts of passion. Those were not acts of insanity. And so I definitely disagree with the psychologist on that one. But it was interesting to read about. Another thing that was interesting to read about was just the legal system in 1966. Just little aspects, like, for example, the method of execution at that time was hanging. in Kansas. And to me, that seems like something that would have been done away with so long ago. But no, halfway through the 20th century, we were still doing that. I had no idea. Another thing was Kansas, at least at this time, when this crime occurred, they didn't have the option of life in prison without the possibility of parole as a sentencing. It was either life in prison with the possibility of parole or execution. That seems absurd to me, but that's how it was, and I think that makes a lot more sense as to like why execution was chosen. I don't have specific views on execution. I think it, very situational, but I think with this community being very religious, they may have been more hard pressed to choose execution over life in prison without the possibility of parole, but they didn't have that option. So I kind of understand why that ended up being the sentencing, given the options that they did have. I do just want to address a couple other things that I saw when looking into critiques of this book, specifically from people who were involved. There is a scene, the final scene of this book, where we get a little bit of like resolution as far as the friends of Nancy, just a few people. It's not everyone, but we see Dewey, the investigator, stop by the Clutter's grave, and he has a little bit of internal monologue. He runs into Sue Kidwell, who was Nancy's friend, and they just talk about how she's doing a lot better. We get a semblance of them having moved on with their lives. Bobby, Nancy's boyfriend, he's gone and actually gotten married, so he's clearly better. Last we saw him, he was in a deep state of depression. But when Dewey was asked about this scene's interaction with Sue, it never actually occurred. So it was kind of upsetting learning that the little bit of resolution that Truman Capote did include in the book, which, by the way, was like a page and a half after the execution, so not very much at all. It was upsetting to learn that was fictional. Obviously he included some facts, because Bobby did get married, like I think 4 years after the crime occurred, but it would have been nice to have an actual resolution regarding the people who weren't the perpetrators, but he didn't seem to care too much to include that. Additionally, Bobby, he did speak out, and he said that he didn't think Truman Capote really did right by the Clutter family, and I agree. In the first portion, we do get, what is probably a pretty fictionalized account of their last day, but we don't learn too much about them. Bobby said that he kind of focused too much on what was done to them and not who they were as people. And I agree. I think that we should really be highlighting the humanity of the victims, because that's what true crime is really about. It's about the victims. But Truman Capote certainly did not really seem to focus on that. Again, his focus was far too much on the perpetrators, in my opinion, and I would have liked to have seen a more well-balanced story, including the lives of the victims, details of the victims, who they were in life, as well as their friends and family and the aftermath that they went through, and we just didn't get nearly enough of that. But yeah, overall, those are my thoughts on In Cold Blood. It is interesting to see like the beginning of a genre, and it was an interesting book. I just overall think that it was far too much focus on the perpetrators. I really think Truman Capote could have used the sympathy that he had for Perry and put that towards sympathy for the family who was killed and the family of those who were killed. But alas, he did not do that, which is unfortunate. But those are the 3 books that I read for this 100-book bucket list challenge so far. Just to wrap up, I read Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, 1984 by George Orwell, and In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. So I think we got an interesting balance of genres. Nothing was too long this time, but we did get a historical fiction, a dystopian, and a true crime. Hopefully we'll continue to have a range of genres in the next coming episode, but that will be it for this one, and I will start on a new one very soon. Hopefully I'll see you there. Bye.